Remember, people are black and white and paper thin.
Since when did we turn on terrible writing advice?
I was just going to name drop that.
Welcome to Worldcasting, where we discuss real, made-up things. I'm your host, Dino, and today you'll be joining us as we talk about governments, economics, trades, and occupations, all of which have been themes for the Worldbuilding Magazine, with trades and occupations being our latest issue. Today joining me are Adam, BK, and Imachinate. If you'd be so kind as to introduce yourselves.
Hello, my name's Adam, and I am Vice Editor-in-Chief at the magazine. I just wanted to say congrats to everyone who helped put this one out. It's been a crazy year, and thank you to everyone who has supported and been a part of it.
Hi, I'm BK Bass. I am the writing chair for the magazine, and I'm also an author of science fiction, fantasy, and horror.
Hello, I am Imachinate, the editorial chair here at Worldbuilding Magazine. Just super glad to be here and happy to celebrate another year of the magazine.
Glad you all could be here today, and we are essentially getting ready to celebrate the end of Volume 3 here and begin next year's Volume 4, which will begin with the arts. So to get us off on a great start, we will go back to the world that was in Volume 1 with the governments issue. And we'll chat a bit about governments, what they are, why they're important to your world building, and some of the types that you can see. And maybe we'll start off with, there's a lot of different governmental forms. And they can be things like our stuffy bureaucratic federal republic that we live in here in America, or in other countries around the world that are democratic republics. And they could be something completely insane, awesome. Personally, my favorite form of government is the thalassocracy, which is a really weird word that essentially means the rule of the sea, which is the ship empires of old. Many nations have kind of identified as this, most famous being the Republic of Venice. Some would argue the late period Achaemenid Persian Empire, and even the Britannic Empire at its height and the age of imperialism. So just going over to you guys, what are some of the more interesting forms of government you've seen in media or you've postulated yourself?
I think as simple as the governmental form really is, monarchism is really interesting to me because it varies completely based on whoever the monarch is. So when you encounter one, it's going to most likely be very different than the last one you saw because the character who is in charge of everything is so different. I like it as a kind of baseline because it's really easy to explain and understand, but there's so much complexity to it with how it is interpreted and ran.
And branching off of what Adam said about monarchies, one of my favorite forms of government to study is feudalism. Something I think, a few interesting things about that. One is the hierarchy of it, where you have, different lords at different ranks is really interesting. Your dukes, your barons, and earls. And also that it's tied to the economy so closely, where the feudal system is really an economic and a government system. The way they go hand in hand, tie together, and how the military is very involved in every layer of the process is really interesting to me. I also think theocracies are really interesting, where you have a religion actually controlling the government. It can be a really interesting thing to work in your world building.
I'm going to join in on the monarchy bandwagon. that Adam started. I really like I don't like it in practice, obviously, but I like the concept of the absolute monarchy that kind of also, because of the kind of context, some often religious context with absolute monarchies, ties into theocracies somewhat. But generally, I just like seeing governments that either rely on one or in world building, not like in real life. Disclaimer. But seeing dictatorships and monarchies and oligarchies, those things where you invest the power in a select few, I think it opens up a lot of shenanigans that's particularly helpful for not just helpful, but also kind of ripe for usage in narratives because you are able to focus on certain figures and kind of narrow down your spectrum. Because I think in world building, trying to really replicate and encompass, let's say, an entire democratic republic, one, it's a lot of work, but two, it could suffer from lack of focus, I think, from a world building perspective, unless it's done really well.
Yeah, I want to bounce back on that and say, you mentioned shenanigans. I think really, if you want to work shenanigans into it, bureaucracy, like the democratic republics, things like that, like this kind of system we have in America, is actually really good for that. And it depends on what kind of world you're building and what kind of story you're trying to tell. But if you wanted to get into like government corruption and, different factions vying for power and things like that, where you have more people involved in the government gives you a lot more to play with there.
And you can definitely range in characters with essentially what their organization is trying to do. I definitely love the like corporatist police state for that like bureaucratic like espionage kind of style of story. And it's just because, like you said, it's more people are involved with the government. I think likewise for things like D&D and fantasy, having that feudal monarchical society that has this almost like theocratic bent with the sacral kingship, it lends itself so easily to the genres that you try to play in and with. As far as monarchic itself, it is so true, Adam, that essentially like no two kings and or absolutists are the same. And there's so many different ways to play with it. Like the formula, it's so variable, and everyone loves a good evil king, like an evil king to just hate on, like Joffrey from Game of Thrones.
And one thing to add to that as well is that, even if you're not the king, you don't have all the power, you can find ways to exploit what power you do have. So, for example, I've been reading today In the Field Marshal's Shadow by Brian McClellan. It's a collection of short stories from his Powder Mage universe. And it's really cool because you never get really any glimpse at the king that's mentioned. You never really see him as benevolent or cruel or anything of the sort, but you see people around him who are kind of speaking with his voice. So you see one of the field marshals. Actually, you don't even see him. You hear about him and you hear what his orders are, and you get kind of third-hand impressions of this guy who's just close to the king. And you sort of see him exploiting what power he has because it was bestowed upon him by the king, which is also really interesting because it's a monarchy and you aren't even seeing the people in charge, you're just seeing the people around him and hearing about what they do.
That makes me think of Warhammer 40,000. You've got the God Emperor of Mankind, and he's basically a corpse on a chair. He doesn't actually do anything. But you have this whole galactic empire, all these systems of control, all based off of his authority.
people speaking with his voice to enact what they want to happen.
Yeah, pretty much. But it's the underlings that are actually, they're after their own agendas.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not too familiar with Warhammer 40k, but isn't it essentially a theocracy, but the gods are actually real? I mean, not to say other gods aren't, but there's divine oomph behind it that can smite and destroy planets.
Oh yeah, the human faction in that universe, the leader that I mentioned, the God Emperor of mankind, and he's the emperor. They view him as a god, and he was at one time a living person that actually united humanity and led this crusade among the stars. Like he's basically revered as a god, but he's basically a corpse, like on a life support system, kind of. But there's evil chaos gods that actually have whole and can do stuff, and demons. It's basically fantasy in space.
Yeah, it's like a bureaucratic theocracy, but the theocracy branch of it tries to vie for control with the other militaristic branches, which kind of goes to show how you can use governmental types and split them into pieces to figure out exactly what you want to graft them into.
Yeah, you've got the religious branch of it, the military branch, and then the technological branch. There's 3 branches of the government. I can't remember the names of them right off the top of my head. And then they're all, have their own things that their own agendas that they're trying to apply.
Yeah, and that way you can really play into whatever genre you're trying to write for. For example, a theocracy with a living god as the leader, that's a government itself. But this time, it's not just word of mouth or followers preaching scripture or what have you. You have an actual god that may or may not get angry if someone were taking their lands or stepping into their geopolitical boundaries, for example. So that really adds a certain dynamic. And of course, you can do that to scientific megacorps forming an oligarchy in either a punk or a high sci-fi setting. So just a lot of things you can do by leaning into not just the strengths, but also kind of the hallmarks of a genre, and then tying your government into it to make it almost iconic of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I was thinking with monarchies and the feudal system is you have these larger than life figures with your kings and your dukes, knights, and stuff like that, and just taking it a step further and having the monarch or whoever your supreme leader is being an actual deity. Having those strong characters, especially for fiction writing, is really good. If you want to focus on those government figures, having those larger than life figures is really good.
It's also an interesting way to frame what characters you want in your story by choosing a government type. Like I kind of mentioned before, the evil king everyone loves to hate, or the hero king everyone cheers for. The Adam had mentioned with the Gunpowder Mage is it a trilogy still? Series. And it's this post-revolution realm, and you have a field marshal as the main character, and then you have to realize where that fits into the government as well, and how all of this kind of blends together to essentially help create the cast of characters as a tool. It's not something you have to obsess over, think every little piece about. It's just a framing device, like everything else. It just helps set it up, at least in my opinion.
It depends on the story. If the story's about the government, then you would focus more on it. If the story doesn't really involve the government, then it's just part of the background and the scenery.
It is easy to just have it be a backdrop.
Yeah, I think I just want to add to that as well. Knowing what the government is like is really important, but it's not necessarily going to directly impact every story. So have that knowledge, but don't feel like you have to use it all the time, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it can be part of the foundation that you're building the culture on.
Or even the reason why in a narrative something happens, but you don't have to actually go into why a government is doing it, as long as it's relevant to, I'd say, the main characters, for example, or the main plot point.
Yeah, for sure.
And don't be afraid to experiment, especially if it is a backdrop piece. Just try and have fun with thinking something crazy up. It can be so interesting, the pathways that will open up just by putting together a governmental form that just looks neat on paper. Personally, one of my main nations in my setting is a meritocratic autocracy where the most eligible person is voted to be the autocrat. And like that in the real world makes that, like, that's just a good on paper. That's never going to happen in practice kind of thing. And it's so interesting to be able to play with it though, and see how the minds of the people would have to be to allow that to exist. And it never really impacts much in the way of story or world building outside of that place. It's just something fun to play with. And I think that that's the main point with world building with governments, unless you really want to showcase a government.
Well, to not exactly counter, but kind of a contrast to your example, my setting has multiple factions that are essentially governments of themselves, but there's only maybe as a whole, there's only 2 actual countries, for example, that count as countries by our geopolitical standards. And those countries have very centralized governments. And one also happens to be a theocracy. But all the other major factions are essentially oligarchies who have control over territories but aren't solidified as nations. And in my case, the fact that there's so many decentralized factions or factions that are only loosely controlling territories has become a problem that my players in my D&D campaign have to deal with. Because when there's an overarching conflict, like a war against an ancient evil, where you want people to work together, it becomes a hassle to try to get all these different political factions to see eye to eye, or at least to put their well-being on a back burner compared to the well-being of an entire continent.
That's an interesting point too. A lot of the government systems that we're talking about are, going to be used in larger countries or kingdoms at least. But you can have, small as like a city state. And, if you're just looking at like one city and all surrounding territory, it's interesting to look at that too and kind of think of different ways to work that out. I've got a couple, one of my worlds that are city states that are controlled by merchant councils. Basically, the economic elite run the city. And then you've also got like different tribal governments and things like that too. You might have like nomadic tribes or not really organized cultures that don't have that centralized or like a territorial system, or maybe like they are not tied to the land; they're just tied to the people.
And the rule of wealth is one of the more interesting ones, I think, to play with and see. And the examples in history are awesome to look at, like ancient Carthage and Venice. And it is something that's on a much smaller scale, I would say. Like, their world felt so vast, but to us, it's just a tiny corner of it. It's interesting to see how that has developed.
Yeah, I think you grow like Carthage, started off as just a city. It was actually the article I wrote in the recent issue about mercenaries actually deals with Carthage quite a bit. And it started off as a colony that got cut off, and then it was kind of an isolated city-state, and then grew into an empire, but it still remained a oligarchy. It was still controlled, the economy ran the empire.
The plutocratic oligarchy, which essentially just means that the most wealthiest men with the highest net worth rule, and once it dropped, they no longer ruled. So it's interesting to see something that you'd think that's only in cyberpunk. No, that happened in the real world.
Yeah, I was thinking as you're describing this, I'm like, cyberpunk fantasy, neat.
And there's a lot of historical examples and even modern examples where basically wealth runs the show. And you could get into a modern political debate about our own society about, but it's actually really common, and it's one of the most, if you wanted to create a government-free world that just makes sense, the people with the money having the power just makes sense in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that should cover most of the bases for most stories, honestly.
Wealth isn't just raw gold. It's capital of any kind.
It's military power, too, especially back in the day. And speaking of mercenaries again, if you have wealth and you have military power, you can train people, you can supply them better, you can equip them better, and then that, of course, you control the military, you can control whatever you want.
So, speaking of wealth, we'll segue into our next topic on economics. And essentially, what is that wealth that you can control? What is the basis of, resource and control, which allowed people like governments to rule, and people within governments to gain leverage over their own government? So essentially, we briefly discussed on Carthage and the idea of mercenaries and how that's using capital in a military sense to secure control. What other forms of essentially resource and control are there to you guys? For example, tradespeople, merchants, and just resource warring in general. How do you think it plays into world building?
I mean, all wars are fought over resources in some form. And so much of our storytelling involves conflict such as a war or the building to it. So in a very simplistic form, resources are hugely important. You don't want your protagonists going to fight your antagonists over nothing at all. You need motivation, you need something that one party needs that the other has. And it could be as simple as wood or clay or something of those natures where there's a massive shortage and they can't purchase any, so we've got to fight for it or figure out an alternative.
No, it makes sense. Commodities are the basis of any economy.
That's pretty much all I'm trying to say, is that there are things which get overlooked, I feel, and really figuring out what resources are available or not available to a group dictates so much and really can drive a plot.
And if you want to look at like the most basic of commodities and what most historic economies were built around, is actually food supply. Actual agriculture formed the basis of a lot of historical economies.
Yeah, essentially, resources, they're the cause, means, and results for most conflict. They're the cause because you need a reason to pretty much engage someone to go to war, or else it's going to seem petty. And people will be petty when they fight, for example, in wars. But most of the time, people look for a reason to engage in some sort of conflict, whether it's like outright aggression via wars, or you can have economic conflicts where you're trying to choke out trade routes or control a market. But to actually fight those conflicts, you usually need resources so that you can support your efforts. And the results are you acquiring more resources and so on and so forth, whether it's you or you as in a faction or another faction. I was going with that somewhere. I was going somewhere with that.
I want to bounce off of that idea that all conflicts are based off resources, and just say on the other side of the coin, there are conflicts that are based off of ideological differences.
Mm-hmm.
Resources might definitely play a role in the logistics of it, but there can definitely be an ideological reason to go to war. But yeah, I would say, more often than not, resources are definitely a cause.
I think if you have enough money to throw at something, you can just silence someone else's ideology. But that's just me.
Well, if they're strong enough about their ideology, you can't buy them into changing their mind. Then you get something like the Crusades.
Yeah, you don't have to buy them into changing their mind. You can buy someone else to change their mind for them by any means necessary.
And we're back to mercenaries.
Always back to mercenaries. Mercenary Pope one. Then you have mercenaries on Crusade.
We do speak of resources as like food and money, but another facet to that I think as well is kind of the results of that, getting more into translating currency or capital into, let's say, services, commodities, technology, for example. Because there is a certain point in our history where you don't win wars by just throwing more people at it. You win wars by developing better ways to get rid of the people on either side, or some other weapon or progression or development that will help you perhaps win a war bloodlessly. Doesn't always have to be fighting necessarily.
Wasn't it Desert Storm that was like one of the shortest operations, or maybe, I don't know if it classifies as a war in history, just because, when the US went in, they had air superiority and better technology, better resources, basically. And it was over incredibly fast.
Yeah, that it technically was a police action, would be the actual definition of it. And there was almost no fighting at all there. I think we mostly hit technological targets like radar systems, so they couldn't shoot surface to air missiles. I think there might have been one tank battle, if I'm remembering correctly, with the Republican Guard, and then after that, they just hightailed it out of Kuwait. I don't think we actually crossed over into Iraqi territory in that. If we did, it was only like a couple of miles just to chase them out of Kuwait, but that was over really fast.
Yeah, I guess that kind of, in a way, falls into what Imachinate's talking about. The U.S. just threw a whole bunch of resources at a problem, and it was far more than the opponents could really muster.
Yeah. Like I said, we basically threw missiles at their radar system, so they couldn't throw missiles back at us, and they were like, well, yeah, it just became a one-sided engagement at that point. So it was attacking the military infrastructure instead of the military manpower.
And what did the US gain from that? Resources, I think.
Yeah, well, we were defending an ally, and of course, the ally was a trade partner, and we got oil from Kuwait and all that good stuff. So yeah, it was defending, a trade partner.
That tank battle is both relevant to the idea of throwing money at a problem and technology, and how technological advancements through a wealthier economy matter, because essentially, as I recall, a sandstorm hit, and the Republican Guard of Iraq's sensors, like their scanners and radars, weren't as advanced. Their optics weren't as advanced as the US's, and so we essentially could see them, and they couldn't see us, and they were devastated. So sometimes the nation that can just increase its tech because its economy is stronger and it has more power in the science sector, that can matter. And that could be the same in a fantasy setting where the more magically advanced, more magical researched faction could eke out a victory over someone who's considered an equal or greater opponent.
Yeah, you could even look at, looking at fantasy, even without putting magic into it. was looking at technologies back then, and something as simple as iron or steel versus bronze. If you have an army equipped with all bronze weapons and an army equipped with all steel weapons, the army with the steel is going to win because the bronze weapons are going to be able to hold up against them.
Yeah, using that example, the bronze faction might win a couple of battles, but they're not going to win the war.
Yeah, their equipment's just not going to hold up. Especially like if their armor is bronze, the steel will go right through it. It's like steel arrowheads will punch right through like a bronze breastplate. So that they're, it might not be like a sudden victory, but it will definitely, if it's a war of attrition, they would definitely lose.
They at least have the capability of winning engagements by just having superior technology. That is most definitely true.
Yeah, tactics and numbers would definitely come into it. Familiarity with terrain. There's so many other factors, but that would be a huge technological advantage to a ancient culture.
Fully agree. And talking about the economics of the ancient world, it even was a big part of the world back in the Bronze Age. The late Bronze Age, right before the collapse, you had an interconnected world that's globalized, almost similar to ours today, where you only had 2 degrees separating most of the actual nations in the twin fertile crescences of the Nile and the Tigris Euphrates. And there were quite a few nations there, and they all kind of knew of each other. And so economics also plays in with trade, spreading the word of other places, and how those places can then rely on each other.
Yeah, and that, and segueing back into our relationship with Kuwait, our involvement in Desert Storm, that those trade agreements, those create allies, those create relationships.
I was mulling over what you brought up regarding the technological aspects of it. I just can't help but think that it's a process to get to that technological superiority. If we look at in our history in real life, the nations that have managed to make those strides, either in weaponry, for example, firearms, I think the citation is that they were first developed in China.
Yeah.
Yes, and then eventually Europeans got a hold of them, and it kept being cited as the reason why, during the age of colonialism, of imperialism, why there was certain European superiority, because they had technological advancement. And why does this society happen to invent these things, or to find them, to make use of this technology, or get to that point, whereas others are not? And I think that comes down to kind of recycling back to that the need for advancement. And that cycles back to both needing and having resources from that economic standpoint, of control over resources.
Yeah, it's like you're not going to be able to make steel if you don't have access to iron and tin. You just wouldn't be able to do it.
Have a good source of burnable carbon, such as coke. Not the drug, the actual substance.
The fuel.
The fuel. There we go. But
solid.
You couldn't make bronze without tin either, and it was copper and tin. And the people who controlled tin in the Bronze Age were some of the strongest nations, like the Hittites of modern day Turkey. They were sitting on one of the largest tin deposits in the world. And tin is incredibly rare on the lithosphere, the surface layer of the earth. It's in several deposits, but they're always huge deposits. So essentially most of the tin, almost all of it, in fact, in the Bronze Age flowed through the Hittites. And they were thus warlike and powerful because they had to always defend it. They seized it and then had to fight everyone else off.
Did that give them an economic advantage in trading those resources with other cultures?
As far as can be told, yes, it gave them an edge, but the fear of cutting off the tin supply always meant essentially war would be declared. I believe in one of the Ugaritic letters from Ramses to the Hittite king, he essentially threatened that, like, we will be brothers if the tin flows, but if the tin does not, then we shall fight.
And so that's something else I was thinking of. We're talking about a culture developing a technology. Once they develop that, that's something you're bringing us back to the topic of economics that we were discussing. Do they decide to use that as an economic advantage and not just a military advantage?
A long, long time back, when Spain was still this big imperialist power, they found a lot of platinum in Ecuador. They ended up dumping all of that platinum into the ocean because people were using platinum to counterfeit money. And this was before platinum had a big, big use for it. So that was like its prime use at the time. It feels like probably one of the biggest, not one of the biggest, but a really big economic oopsie, considering how important and valuable platinum would be in like probably a few hundred years after that point.
That'd be something interesting to play with too. You could have a culture that has one of these valuable resources or useful resources and not have the scientific know-how to be aware of what it could be used for and be sitting on it. And you can kind of write that into a story, kind of turn a trope on its head that, this nation has all this gold or this iron and they don't know what to do with it and they don't care.
And that feeds right into trade, in that if you have a resource and you need to exploit it, you need to find a market to sell it in. Trade is the lifeblood of economics. It's one of the main reasons it exists, and that's internal trade in a nation and then international trade on a world stage, even if it is just to, say, neighbors. And that's a whole key part of economics, and trying to focus on that is very difficult. I know that one of the best examples is the anime Spice and Wolf for talking about medieval economics. But it does tend to be a subject that most people fall asleep at. So I would like to instead focus on the people that trade relies on. That's merchants, caravaneers, artisans, craftsmen, the trades and occupations based around all that we've talked today about. To get us started on this, how about we just kind of talk about using trades to showcase world building, specifically interesting real life trades and trades that could be specific to genres and settings. This could be like the Valyrian steelsmiths of Game of Thrones to a artificial limb creator in a cyberpunk setting, or even a steampunk setting with clockwork limbs. What do you guys think?
I did always like Valyrian steel. It kind of became a meme at some point because it was this rare and amazing thing, but then somehow every noble house in Westeros had their own Valyrian steel bauble. So I think that's kind of a case in both using it well and also poorly, because Martin did place so much Valyrian steel around the world. So even though the people who created it were gone, and it was this highly valuable resource, this very sought after thing by nobles, it still didn't feel that special as a reader or as a viewer of the show. So I think really it's both a success story and a cautionary tale in terms of creating these valuable resources.
Yeah, as far as what Dino was asking, as far as the occupations, I think it's a good way to really create a flavor for a story where, depending on what kind of genre and what kind of setting you're working in, like with like a cyberpunk setting, if you've got these underground hackers and stuff like that, that's more prominent than it might be in another culture. or like if you've got professional dragon slayers in a fantasy world, you can really emphasize what's important to a culture by what professions are either prominent or more respected in a culture.
That's true. That reminds me as well. Someone here within our Discord server, we were talking with them a couple days ago, I think, and he's working on this world that's kind of inspired by the Polynesian areas. And there's a profession of divers within his world that are diving into the waters to look for these pearls, which are magical in nature. And the seas are so dangerous and the pearls so valuable that being a diver is hugely respected, which I like a lot because it's taking this very common term, diver. At first glance, you think of it as like maybe someone's diving for fun, or maybe they're at most maybe a underwater, nature photographer or something. I don't know. But then he's taken that very basic concept and kind of turned it on its head, and it's now this hugely dangerous, highly valuable profession, which is seeking out magical items. I just think that's super cool.
Yeah, that's a great example because right there, just with that, you're tying in your culture, your geography, your economy, and your magic system.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, professions are occupations, professions, however you might want to call it, are a really great way of characterizing a setting in a way that it's that can be actively followed. Just because, and this is my opinion, just because most readers and most people will have kind of this lens, this familiarity with working with a job that you as a creator, as a writer, as a world builder can make certain presumptions about professions already. Oh, that they're getting paid for this. They're probably doing it for so-and-so time during so-and-so hours. They might be seasonal. There might be a permanent job. It's kind of some background things that we, because we live it in our real lives, don't really think about as us having that knowledge embedded, that then you as a creator can kind of pull on to make something seem familiar but also unique as per each setting. And that's why in Adam's example, he gave that diver example that is probably common in the world, but is in that world and also common in our world, yet unique enough within the context that becomes memorable. But to kind of also build up on that, it's also possible to have more common professions like a craftsman, like a smith, a letter worker, that's both common in our world, but can still be not exactly iconic, but relatable in a setting just because we are knowledgeable of it. And it is so important, kind of central to this idea of, and to harken back to technological advancement, to creating, to making use of resources, that we can kind of connect to it because it makes sense.
I think connecting it back to your setting, such as with the example of the divers, is really one of the best parts about it and the whole point of really doing it.
Yeah, I think he did a great job with the divers. And I do agree as well that it's something, what do people do in your world is maybe not the most exciting thing to work on, but it's super important to describe what is happening in that world. So, like, if the economy is good, let's say, then there's probably a lot of trade going on. People are living comfortably, or at least generally more comfortably, and, kind of going about their days, not too much on their minds, that they're worried about. If there is, it's probably less impactful things. And then if the economy isn't as good, then people are going to be looking for jobs. Maybe unemployment is higher. What jobs are available is going to be, very important to know as well. So it's definitely one of those items to consider within its own scape, as well as how it is impacted by or impacts pieces of the world outside of the work.
And from a fiction writing standpoint, it's really important to base things around people and tying people to the world, and the profession's a really good way to do that. And that diving example is a good way where you can solve the show don't tell problem. Instead of telling the reader that there's these magic pearls in the world, or just sticking them in there, you're actually showing, somebody doing an activity that's active, it's interesting, it's exploring the environment, and then it's introducing that element. And using professions as a way of giving a character in a story an action to perform that introduces a new element of your world is a good way to weave world building into your narrative without info dumping.
I agree with BK. And the whole profession's telling a lot about your world. And I kind of want to tie that in with what Adam said, because he brought up a very good notion of prosperity versus not. A nation, a society that is prosperous will have this level of comfort that allows certain professions to exist. For example, artists, just harkening back to the Renaissance, artists, writers, pretty much anyone that wasn't really doing a direct, kind of like a direct trade that results in crafting an item that might be considered essential either to everyday life or, in some cases, military purposes. They had this opportunity to pursue such professions because there was an excess of resources, there was a surplus, there was wealth, there was people willing to spend money on them. But when you kind of pull back on how much the average person has, some of those professions will cease to exist. And there will be a focus on crafting, on trade, maybe medicine if the level of technology is supportive of actual doctors. And it's a good way to, like BK said, to show the state of the world is what professions are going on. Or, if you kind of want to take it a step further, to see how things have progressed either from less to more or more to less, as people who were writers or artists are struggling to do what they want to do or what they're good at because people can't pay for it anymore.
Yeah, and in the same vein, real quick, when you have a more successful economy, then that's also when you get more specialization. So not just people being able to perform the arts and all the less vital pieces of a society, but also you get very specific jobs. If you are working on an assembly line, you can have somebody whose job it is just to do this one specific thing and then pass it on to the next person. Whereas in a society that isn't able to get as specific, maybe one that isn't performing as well or doesn't have as high a population, then you would have that same person performing multiple different jobs.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, off of what Imachinate said, that that's a good way to show economic disparity also. You can have an impoverished area and a wealthy area all in the same culture, even the same city. where you can show an area that's having economic hardships and then walk a mile down the road and have your artists and your large homes and your nobility and whatnot. That's a good way to show contrast between different levels of society too.
Showing the contrast in strata, especially for fantasy, there is a phenomenal book. It is by Lisa J. Steele, and it's called Thief, a look at medieval society from its lower rungs. It is a phenomenal book that just essentially breaks down like the high Middle Ages economy of France and what that meant for peasants in a complete and totally digestible way. It's under 100 pages. It's so worth the read if you are DMing, writing a fantasy novel, and you kind of want that realistic edge to things, and you just don't know what's keeping you from having it. Definitely gets to recommend because it taught me a lot about the reality of it and what happened, and showing the difference between strata, poor and rich, and how their lives actually went about. It really made a difference in both my writing and my DMing. So for you guys, with trades and occupations and talking about social strata, do you feel like there are some, say, trades and occupations reliant wholly upon your essentially class, your upper or lower rung class? And how can you show that in world building?
I think it just depends on your setting. And it depends on kind of what has been made accessible within a society. For example, in my setting, mages are considered this sort of elite profession, elite because they can either be scholars, they can serve in court to powerful political figures, they could be adventurers, but they're not really allowed to use their skills for general trade stuff. There's a kind of regulation of magic in my setting. However, magic is something that can occur to anyone of all ages. So kind of the regulating body for magic accepts anyone from whatever class, so long as they have that expressed aptitude for it, and they train them to fulfill one of these rare professions.
It's also in large part about what you're around and born into. You can kind of complain about it all you want, but we see this today as well. Like, who you know and what you are exposed to is hugely impactful with what jobs you're able to get, what things you're taught to do. And I think that applies to any setting for the most part as well. Even if magic comes to anyone, the people who have access to training for it, if you have to have tests done to see if you can perform magic, then those people are going to be more prone to displaying magical talent.
Yeah, that's why I think it's a lot easier to justify having masses of unskilled individuals that eventually might just become the massive labor force for I don't want to say menial labor, but they're considered in some cases to be bodies that can provide their physicalities. That is their trade, is being able to move stuff around, being able to do these tasks that don't require years of training.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Dino asked about social strata versus professions, and that really leads into what I was going to talk about, was that historically speaking, and even in modern times, that most jobs that need to be filled are manual labor. It's just basically like some moving stuff around, moving dirt around, agriculture, field workers, things like that. And, as you go up in social strata, usually with that, the professions held by the upper echelons of the culture usually require more education and training. So, above your manual laborers, you have your craftsmen, your blacksmiths, your potters, things like that. And as you go up, your silversmith would be like an example of the next step up, and then your scribe. The more education and training is required to perform a job, the higher social standing you're going to have involved with that. Access to that training might depend on what social status you're born into, like Adam mentioned. And if you're born the son of a farmer, you might be a farmer. That just might be your lot in life. You might not have any choice in the matter.
Usually you required money to enter into service. Like you wanted into the clergy, you had to pay. You wanted to apprentice, you had to pay. So it kind of makes sense that they would be a little locked, especially in a historical or fantasy situation. It's technically, you could argue that university is kind of the same way currently.
Yeah, it's definitely the same way right now. Yeah, that brings us back to whoever has the money has the power.
I'm sensing I had an overarching theme here.
Government, economics, and professions, it definitely all ties together.
Yep, especially when it comes to money. So on the topic of money, in the current issue of Trades and Occupations, BK here has an amazing article called Blood for Money. And I think that there's pieces in there that you didn't get a chance to talk about there. Would you like to talk about them here?
Yeah, I can briefly talk about a few things that I planned to put in the article, but I didn't get to.
We made him stop because it was too long.
Yeah, I got a gag order. They put the leash on me and started.
It wasn't a gag order, it was a chainsaw order.
But yeah, the original idea was to start with as far back as I had to get, or as I could get in ancient times, and find a reference to somebody fighting for financial or personal gain, and then go forward. And I was going to go all the way up to modern times and talk about some sci-fi examples. Like everybody said, it just got too long. It was getting way too long to go over all of it. So I went from that ancient example up to kind of the advent of gunpowder and how that changed society and kind of changed the Industrial Revolution and changed the profession in more of a professional, organized profession. And that was a good place to cap it off because it was kind of like it showed the evolution of it coming from, in the beginning, it was kind of ad hoc and it was not organized at all, up to becoming something where there was actually merchants doing mercenaries. There were, we would call them managers or, agents, that were trading in, flesh for war. Going beyond that, I was going to talk some about modern times because there's still, you see mercenaries and you see security companies is what they call them a lot of times now, but it's still basically mercenary companies, but providing security roles, which is a good segue into science fiction where, you have your cyberpunk setting and you can have your mercenaries in your cyberpunk setting could be a security company where it's a privately funded military organization. And the last thing I really wanted to throw in there, but I didn't get a chance to, was my favorite example from science fiction of mercenaries is from the Battletech universe. Mercenaries feature very, very prominently in there, from the board game, the source books, up to the latest video game that got put out by Harebrained Schemes, the Battletech on PC. You're playing as a mercenary in that. Mercenaries play a huge role in that. The assets that they have are very difficult to acquire assets, and it's really well fleshed out there. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Unfortunately, didn't get a chance to. But yeah, basically modern times of science fiction is what got left out, unfortunately. But I think the article does a good job of covering the evolution of the profession from its infancy to becoming something organized and respected among the world.
I would have loved to see like a part 2 of it, just because once you get to modern times, it's not just looking at the profession itself, but also having to trace technological advancements. And that would get really, really bonkers, especially once you get into like futuristic sci-fi territory. For example, the profession itself would evolve along with technology just because people are good at finding ways to dispose of other people, apparently. And I can't help but think of, for example, Shadowrun. Both Shadowrunners as a profession, but also the setting and how that is sort of one way that mercenaries evolve when you're put into like a cyberpunk situation, for example.
Oh yeah, definitely. And you don't have to have like a whole army for mercenaries. Like BattleTech is a good example where you could just have a small number of people, and they have these giant stompy robots basically, and you might just have 4 giant stompy robots and then your techs and engineers and stuff. But it's just a small unit. Or like with the Shadowrunners, you just might be a free agent. You can have just one person and still be a mercenary. You don't have to have 300 people and say, I have mercenaries in my story. You just have one dude be a mercenary. A sellsword or a gun for hire is all it takes.
Exactly. And especially when you put in like technology. For example, in Shadowrun, there is a role called the Decker. And all he does is go into the Matrix. And the Matrix is essentially the internet, but turned into real life. Everything runs on wire, on the Matrix, on connectivity. So guns, armor, sentry turrets, vehicles can be hacked. Anything can be hacked. And so one Decker is essentially could be a full mercenary company if he manages to take control of an opposing squad's machinery and technology, because everyone's going to have technology.
That's a really good example of somebody having like an elite skill set, and that one individual being really valuable versus your 1,000 guys with muskets.
I think for a follow-up article, if you ever have the impetus to do one, it'd be interesting to look at the political connotations and reactions of having mercenaries, such as, for instance, going back to like the Company of St. George taking Thessalonica, to the Revolutionary War, where you have the air quote Hessians, all the German prince mercenaries who aided the British, and so on, going up to the modern day where you have mercenaries and being used in the recent war on terror. So I think that there's a lot more room to grow with it, and it already covers so much. It's an awesome topic that, oddly enough, it ties into everything we talked about today with governments, economics, and trades.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I'd probably definitely be interested in writing a follow-up down the road. And there's a couple things in the article that got touched on. If anybody's read it, they'll know what I'm talking about. Or if you haven't read it yet, I definitely would say you should. Like with Carthage, there's an example where they had a mercenary army, and at the end of I believe it was the First Punic War, they rebelled, and there was this big mercenary rebellion that they had to put down, and they almost lost Carthage to the mercenaries. There's other, examples in history where, a mercenary company might go on to establish their own kingdom or something like that. So there can be a lot of, huge ramifications other than just trading a service for rewards. You can have long-lasting geopolitical ramifications to their presence too.
The subject of geopolitics is an awesome one. Could be covered in the future. Just the idea of how do events relate to each other, and how do people's opinions of those events then create new events. It's something that's probably very hard to keep in mind when world building, and it's one of those things where I like to say that world building can't really be done in a vacuum. You always want someone else to look at it and just kind of give an opinion. And when it comes to like political events and government, that's one of the big times I like to get someone's opinion on it.
Or you could write it in a vacuum and have an economy that is hardly affected by the existence of magic and magical abilities. Like in a in a certain series that will not be named.
Yes, just ignore the fact that magic exists. Make an economy however you want. Just abuse people who can just spread the power of creation to make fireballs. Governments can just crush them. And the final lesson here is mercenaries are always evil and never have a cause. Remember, people are black and white and paper thin.
Since when did we turn on terrible writing advice?
I was just gonna name drop that.
More seriously, don't take what I said seriously, please. Do what Dino says and don't write your world building in a vacuum because it might not make as much sense as you think it is. Have other people look at it. That's always great advice. And that's why we're talking, I think, in part right now, is to give people kind of that insight and the perspective.
Yeah, perspective, definitely. Yeah. Different viewpoints. And, as far as, world building elements in a vacuum, too, is to remember, going back to the geopolitical situation, that everything's connected. Your economy, your culture, your religion, everything's going to tie into each other. So you can't just do one element at a time. Everything's going to feed into everything else.
Once again, it's a spiral that just continuously feeds itself all the way to the bottom and loops back up to the top. It just never ends.
It's the circle of life.
All right. Well, I think then I will take final comments, though those were very final comment-like.
I think overall, trades, occupations, economics, all these things we've been talking about have kind of, if it's not central to your plot, then I tend to see these things get swept under the rug. And kind of like we mentioned before, don't do that. It's bad. Even if it's not central to what you're working on, it's good to have these things in the background so that your secondary characters, your settings, these things can feel more alive and more realistic, even in a very dead or unrealistic place.
Yeah, and building off of that, I would kind of use the analogy again that you're building a foundation that, no matter how much you're planning on featuring it in your final product, be that a tabletop RPG or a book or whatever you're doing, that the economy and the government and your professions, especially the economy and the government themselves, are building a foundation that you're building a culture on. And it's kind of everything runs off of that. It's how it runs and why it runs. And even if you're not going to feature that a lot, you need to know how that works so that as you start adding layers on top of it, there's a steady foundation to hold it up, that everything makes sense. And the other key point I'd want to put in is reiterating what I said before, is that it's all about people, especially when you're writing fiction, that you need to tie it back to people. The professions is a good way to do that. Not info dumping, not telling the reader, this is the kind of government I have, this is how the economy is looking right now. Show it through the eyes of the people. Show, how does the government affect the people? How does the economy affect the people? What kind of professions they have? And what effects does this all have on their day-to-day life? Is a good way to show all these things to your audience.
I absolutely love what BK said. People, people, people. No matter what I make or what media I consume, I tend to focus in on the people. And anyone who is creating with the intent of showing it to an audience should keep that in mind. It's not just a matter of connecting the people within your setting, but also finding that way to connect to the people you're presenting to. Professions do that, showing how someone lives their lives, whether in a rich society or a poor society, no matter their strata, is another way to do that. And just creating that sense of relatability to your setting and to your people.
I think to close it out, I just have to say that these are three concepts that are really hard to just glance at and feel like you have an absolute control over. And a lot of people are uneasy about them. And the best advice I think I can give is to just find something that interests you, read a little bit about it, and just don't stress it. This is one of those parts where, like we've talked about, it's kind of this framing device, and it's not necessary to obsessively worry over it. I mean, it's not good to do that about anything, but in this particular sense, it's one of those things that it's okay to kind of slack on. Some of the greatest pieces of media have terrible, terrible government economics and such, and they're still loved. It's okay to kind of let it take the back burner. And in the words of Rudyard Kipling, gold is for the mistress, silver for the maid, copper for the craftsman, cunning at his trade. Good, said the baron, sitting in his hall, but iron, cold iron, is master of them all. Thank you for listening. You've been tuned into Worldcasting, an affiliate production of Worldbuilding Magazine. Have any feedback, comments, questions, or concerns? You can get in touch with us on our website, worldbuildingmagazine.com. There you can find links to our social media, or feel free to come chat with us on the Worldbuilding Magazine Discord server. Thanks for listening to Worldcasting, and until next week, keep world building.